Hi students, in this video I'm going to talk about kind of the aftermath of the Compromise of 1850. There's a lot of rejoicing and public celebrations when the Compromise of 1850 goes through. But in the end, what the Compromise of 1850 has done has again avoided these growing issues about what are the rights of the states versus the federal government, and what right does the federal government have to abolish slavery? Should the federal government abolish slavery? And so these issues continue. These issues continue to fester. Tensions between proponents of both these positions continue to grow, and we see increasing violence surrounding these issues. And the first examples of violence we have related to the Compromise of 1850 are related to the Fugitive Slave Act, which, if you remember, Henry Clay had wanted to make the Fugitive Slave Act more effective. And the act that is passed is more, I suppose you'd say, more severe than we might expect. That this was a retroactive act. This wasn't simply slaves who had escaped in the previous weeks or so who were being captured by their owners or people employed by their owners. These could be slaves who had escaped months and even years into the past and who now considered themselves safe. These slaves could now, under the Fugitive Slave Act that was passed, they could be recaptured and taken back into slavery. Or free blacks could be kidnapped by slave catchers, accused of being escaped slaves. They would not have the right to a jury, and then they could be taken back to the South and placed in slavery as well. And so quickly you start to see resistance to the Fugitive Slave Act in some of the northern cities, especially Boston, when slave catchers show up there planning to arrest fugitive slaves or those who they think are fugitive slaves. There is resistance in the streets, and slave catchers are driven away. At least for the time being. There's talk of using the army to enforce this act, but by the time the army comes back to Boston, those who are considered fugitive slaves, they've been spirited away somewhere else. So you see public resistance, even violent resistance, to this controversial measure. And this is strengthened by the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin at this time, by Harriet Beecher Stowe, a famous abolitionist who hadn't visited the South, but who writes this very powerful novel about a slave who's trying to escape to freedom. And so this compounds the dissatisfaction in the North, certainly among the abolitionists, with the Compromise of 1850 and the fugitive slave law that it's produced. We also see tensions growing around these issues with the passing of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This was an act that was sponsored and managed through Congress by Stephen Douglas. Stephen Douglas is one of the few Northern Democrats remaining. And so they're seen as the last vestiges of sort of these, a nation united. Remember, our theme this week is a nation divided, that you actually still had a party that could win elections or could win seats both in the North and in the South. At the same time, these Northern Democrats are being squeezed from both sides. On the one side, the abolitionists are pressing them to be more aggressive about opposing the expansion of slavery. On the other side, Southern secessionists are pressuring them to leave this decision to the states. And Stephen Douglas has been very successful in walking this line. He's one of the main reasons why the Compromise of 1850 is passed. But the Kansas-Nebraska Act is the point where he loses this line. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act dealt with the creation of the Pacific Railroad. Trade with Asia, trade with the West Coast was becoming an increasingly lucrative area of U.S. commerce during the middle of the 19th century. And so there was certainly will in Congress to build a new railroad that would connect basically the Mississippi Valley with the West Coast. But Southern politicians had said they would oppose this railroad unless it went through the South. They said we've had enough of new railroads being built, new industry and infrastructure being built that favors the North, that makes the North more wealthy at the political expense of the South. And so Douglas came up with a compromise. Railroad would go through Chicago, through Illinois. Stephen Douglas was a senator from Illinois, but when it went through the territory of Kansas, that would be split. It would be split now into two states, Kansas and Nebraska. Nebraska, which was the state further to the north, would be a free state, but the state of Kansas further to the south, that would be up for grabs. That could, since Kansas was kind of on a line with Missouri, that could become a slave state if the state voted to allow slavery. And so Southern politicians are willing to support this. They see this as an expansion of state rights. Some of them see it as an expansion of slavery. And the Whigs are just furious. This is a betrayal of the Missouri Compromise. This is a betrayal of the Compromise of 1850. And so from this point onwards, you see a recognition among abolitionists and people who were sympathetic to the abolitionists but kind of didn't want to go all the way. They feel that they're also in a war. That whereas the Southern secessionists feel that the northern states, the free states, are becoming more and more powerful, politically powerful and influential as a bloc. They also feel that the Southerners are going to keep pushing the expansion of slavery beyond bounds that have already been existed. And so it's from this point that you start to see recognition of the need to form a new party that's going to focus this energy on abolishing slavery, asserting the authority of the Union. And so it's at this point where the Republican Party starts to come into effect. In terms of how the Kansas-Nebraska Act plays out in the Midwest, Nebraska becomes a free state, Kansas becomes a war zone. Both sides are flooding the territory with their supporters, and you have pro-slavery militias and abolitionist militias. Both of them are fighting against one another. The elections that are carried out are corrupted by violence and corrupt election practices. 200 people die in the next 4 years, and it becomes known as Bleeding Kansas. So here we have regular violence between the two parties in this conflict. In 1856, the Democrats win the presidential election again, and their nominee is James Buchanan, becomes the 15th president of the United States. He is someone who has a distinguished political career based on supporting the westward expansion of the United States and states' rights. And so he's very much someone who is going to support what the southern states want. That the United States is going to continue to expand, and the new states will be able to determine whether slavery is allowed or not. The main event of this period or of this topic that occurs during Buchanan's presidency is the Dred Scott decision by the Supreme Court. Dred Scott was a slave in Virginia, a slave state, whose owner then moved to Missouri, also a slave state, where he was sold and then lived for some time in Illinois and Wisconsin, where slavery was illegal, and then was brought back as a slave to the South. Dred Scott sued that he should not still be a slave because he had been taken into states where slavery was illegal. At that point, his status of being a slave should have ended. And the court finds against him. It finds against him for a number of reasons. Firstly, the opinion says that as an African American, he's not entitled to sue in the Supreme Court. Second, it says that the Missouri Compromise, which allowed the federal government to ban slavery north of the Mason-Dixon line, apart from in Missouri, is unconstitutional. And so, therefore, that even while that southern slave owners can take their slaves into states that are free states, and the slaves remain enslaved. And this was really earth-shattering, because for the northern states, this meant that they were not able to abolish slavery. Even if they abolished slavery through their own legislatures, it meant that someone from out of that state could still bring slaves into the state. And so the Dred Scott decision very much makes it clear that the era of compromise is coming to an end, that one side or the other is going to have to win this conflict. And this is more and more recognized in the North. Whereas perhaps there were some people in the middle ground or in the margins who had said, well, you know, I don't agree with slavery, but I'm not going to get involved in imposing it on the South, or imposing the abolition of slavery on the South. Now they're being told, even in your own state, this can be imposed upon you. And so that's going to increase the power, the influence of those who are promoting abolition. And so with conflict in Kansas, with the Dred Scott decision, we see more and more that this tension around states' rights and slavery is going to come more and more to a head. It's almost certainly going to lead to violence now.